All right. Well, we're happy to have all of you here today, and I will, without any further ado, introduce Dr. Rick Weinzierl, who will be talking to us today about insect pest management of organic production of vegetables. So with that, and Rick, I will help you try to monitor questions and things in the chat box, and we will try to respond to those. And with that, Rick, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. So.
Everybody, you have the slide in front of you that tells the title. You've got my name, so instead of repeating any of those, let's get a start here. You're not really going to be able to answer this in the way we do some of these, where we have a little more interaction. But if you would like to, you can just use the chat box and tell me which one of these you are, whether you are planning to begin gardening, whether you are an organic gardener, whether you're a commercial organic grower, or whether you're a commercial grower who's more sustainable conventional practices. Almost everything I see coming in the chat box is an existing organic grower or organic gardener, a few commercial. So there's a little bit of a range for you here, it looks like. Since you were so good at that, no good deed goes unpunished, let's ask you to do this again with a different question. Just going to ask you a couple of things about insects in vegetable production. So the first one is, infestations of which of these insects are least affected by sanitation, tillage, and crop rotation? Cabbage maggot, Colorado potato beetle, corn earworm, or onion maggot. So take your guesses there about which of these it's least affected by the things you do in terms of sanitation, tillage, and crop rotation. I'll give you another 20 seconds here to send in your guesses. Now at the end, I suspect you're going to answer, a number of you are going to answer differently. Some of you will answer the same. The insect that's least affected is actually corn earworm, C. And it's because it migrates in from other parts of the country, and what we do in advance has little to do with where it decides to land, lay eggs, and cause problems. One more just for kicks. Which of these insects is a new invasive pest that's beginning to threaten many vegetable crops, especially for organic producers? And it's barely here, but on its way. Now you're doing much better on this one, everybody. If you haven't voted yet, you can look in the chat box and vote by CloudSpeak or CrowdSpeak, because it is brown marmorated stink bug, and we'll touch on it just a little bit toward the end. Let's move out of that realm and start to talk about the things that you can do for organic insect management. And the first thing you do is just remember a lot of the practices that are part of good crop rotation, soil building, etc., be they organic or not, are going to be valuable in some way. Crop rotation, cover crops, tillage, time of planting, resistant varieties, interplanting, mulching, using compost, row covers for exclusion, irrigation. OMRI means the Organic Materials Review Institute, OMRI approved insecticides, managing natural enemies, hand removal of pests, and culling. So volume better now, Kyle? Let me know. I just changed it up, moved it up a little bit.
They have control over their own volume on their page. So on the top left-hand side of they can see a little bar that moves. You can control your own volume. You're fine, Rick. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All right, so let's take a look at those just in a general way. I am not going to try to go through all of the basic principles of soil and plant management that are involved in organic production. What I can do is say, for each of these, what are some either good resources or some nuances that have some relationship to insects. There is a very good book available either to order or to simply download a PDF. It's from the SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, on crop rotation on organic farms. Some of it moves to the vegetable scale instead of just large-scale cropping. It's very good, and again, you can either order a printed copy or you can get it as a PDF. For cover crops, the Midwest Cover Crops Council website or homepage is at Michigan State University. You get a little background there. There is a cover crop selector tool that is an online aid to choosing what cover crop might you use given the time frame that you can plant it and your goal for it, whether it's largely nitrogen fixation or soil building in the terms of tilth and organic matter or what it might be. And for those who would rather have something in your hand, there is a pocket guide-sized cover crops field guide done in the Midwest region, and it sells for $4.50 from the site that you see listed here for Purdue. All of those are good for cover crops, and they'll tell you that most of the time the cover crops have minimal influence on insects. Sometimes they do. Tillage as a tool in gardens and at larger scales actually does a lot to kill certain insects, wireworms, white grubs especially, and a number of things that remain just below the soil surface or at the soil surface. Tillage, however, is not unimportant for its negative influence, and that's that it does damage soil structure. So if you till over and over again with the idea that it helps to kill the things in the soil, that's not a good choice either. Some insects are favored by earlier plantings, other by later plantings. We'll look at some of those in just a few minutes. There is probably for organic growers a greater need even than for conventional growers to try to use resistant varieties when you can. Those resistant varieties are primarily going to give you some benefit in disease management and rarely insect management. However, I think they're still pretty important. Interplanting, using either companion plantings or strip cropping of some other crop besides what you're growing for harvest can be quite valuable. You can grow plants to attract beneficial insects, and I've given you a couple of websites that provide a lot more detail for that. The one from Colorado State and the one from Michigan State University, the first two on this list. There are references about plants that repel pests. Generally speaking, these are far less complete in doing what we hope them to do than what the ones that attract beneficial insects are. Repellency is not always a dependable thing. And then there are plants that you would choose to use because they are of great value to pollinators. And while that might not be pest management, it's certainly insect management in a crop. Exclusion methods work for a number of insects: flea beetles, cucumber beetles, squash bugs. You've seen, I suspect, many different kinds of row covers. The original ones were Reme, but there are many different spun-bound polyester row covers that let air and water move through but do exclude insects. Whenever you grow a crop in there that has to be insect pollinated, however, you've got to get the row cover off as soon as bloom begins. Irrigation can be used to help remove mites and aphids from plants, even just the discharge from a hose with the sprayer at the end of it. It doesn't knock everything off, and for those of you who might grow inside a high tunnel or some other cover, one of the great benefits is that you don't get rainfall there, and as soon as you decide to use the hose to wash off plants, you've wet the plants and sort of provided the moisture that might be needed for some plant diseases. But it is an approach that can help you when you need it. Hand removal works if it's the right scale for your operation, and culling is always a choice for everybody. And we'll talk about some specific ways you might choose to use these for different insects as we go along. Natural enemies are really important in insect control, predators, parasites, some pathogens as well. In general, the idea that you would buy and release natural enemies is almost never effective outdoors. There is a good case to be made for buying and releasing predators or parasites of mites or aphids or thrips in high tunnels or greenhouses. Outdoors, there's almost no good data to show that those work very well. You're much better off to try to use the interplantings and specific flowering plants that attract natural enemies and not to use sprays that kill them than you are to try to buy them and release them. There are a couple of really good references. There's a YouTube video from Ohio State University and a two-page guide to natural enemies also that came out of Ohio State as part of the Great Lakes Vegetable Workers Group. Those links at the bottom, those are very good for information about natural enemies. Mulching, whether it be straw mulch or some other mulching materials or plastic mulch, is really valuable in gardening for moisture retention and disease suppression. In terms of insect management, the one case where it's probably most widely used as you grow a little bit larger and you had trouble with Colorado potato beetles in one field, you rotate to another field and use straw mulch along the rows closest to the original site because it slows their movement into potatoes and other crops. Straw mulches also favor spiders, and that's a good thing. They favor slugs. Sometimes plastic mulches help aphids overwinter, even though they might have perished outside had there not been plastic mulch. This year I don't think we're going to see much of that. We're cold enough everywhere. And mulches of one kind or another, be it straw or wood chips or anything else, do favor voles, the mouse-like rodents that cause damage in a number of crops and perennial plants. What about compost? Compost for insect control probably has very little real impact, but it doesn't mean you wouldn't use it. You mix compost for a variety of reasons, from fertility to some disease suppression. You can use it in mixes to start seeds. You can use it as an application to the soil surface. And most of the time it does help with disease management, rarely much impact on insects. And compost teas, these have gained a lot of popularity in press lately. I'm afraid there isn't as much real good information that they work very well for insects. They're made by suspending a porous bag of compost in aerated water to try to get the good coming out of the compost in the water and then use it as a spray. If you do that, you have to make sure that the compost really did heat well enough, and you can't add anything to that compost tea that some sources suggest you do, like molasses or yeast or fish-based products, because then you introduce pathogens back into that, and by pathogens I mean the ones that are foodborne illness pathogens to people. And there's a lot of good research on this that says you got to be really careful. We can actually spray pathogens back onto crops if you use compost that's had additives put back into it, compost teas. So there's a big overview of all the things that are just sort of general practice for organic gardening, and a comment or two about how they fit entomology versus other concerns in gardening. There's often this idea that healthy soils mean healthy plants, and that means there won't be any insects. And I'm afraid I'm not a believer in that philosophy. I do think healthy soils have great benefits. I'm an entomologist. I have a great deal of faith in insects. They've evolved over a large enough number of years and managed to exploit virtually everything in the world. They're going to exploit healthy plants as well. Healthy soils give you better organic matter, better water permeability, better water holding capacity. They give you balanced nutrients. They give you a lot of flora and fauna that may include things that increase the biotic control or the natural control of a number of pests. Sometimes they can favor certain insects. Soils with high organic matter do favor certain insects. They bring them to your crops. That doesn't mean you don't want that organic matter, but you need to manage it in a certain way, and we'll get to a couple of examples. Really, really mobile insects, things like corn earworm, the new brown marmorated stink bug, and spotted winged Drosophila. These insects that move across the landscape to find a crop that suits them are not deterred by a healthy crop. I'm sorry, that's simply not true. You may reduce the number of insects that survive in a location by having a lot of natural enemies and having good soils with natural enemies in those. We're not going to completely get rid of insects by having healthy soils. So what are some of the things you're going to do? Well, we're going to go to specific insects and tillage practices and timing for a few common ones, but you do need to be aware there are, quote, OMRI approved insecticides. That means the Organic Materials Review Institute that says these insecticides meet the requirements of certified organic production. They are generally things derived from microbes or from plants or from substances that are somehow abrasive. So the common ones, the one that's been used since about 1960, is Bacillus thuringiensis, and the subspecies that was first identified was Kerstaki. It's a bacterium that produces some spores and toxins that kill Lepidopterans, so the caterpillar stage of butterflies and moths. They kill only the things that feed on them, so they've been used quite effectively. There is a certain strain or subspecies that's effective against Colorado potato beetle, and a related species, Bacillus papilii, that's effective against Japanese beetle. That one had been sold for years as Doom or milky spore. In recent years, people have identified toxins that poison insects but are very low in toxicity to most everything else from a group of actinomycetes, soil sort of bacteria, fungus-like organisms. And those compounds are called spinosins. They're primarily effective against caterpillars, thrips, and a few other specific things. And Entrust is the trade name of one of those products. There are a number of insect pathogenic fungi. The only one that's been commercialized so far is Beauveria bassiana. The fungi work, if they are effective against a certain insect, only when they're in the right conditions, where there's a lot of moisture or free water. There are certain nematodes that attack just insects. They also require moisture to work. And then there are some other kinds of pathogens. There are protozoans in the genus Nosema. Some of you would have heard of Nosema as a pathogen of honeybees. Well, there's a different species that's a pathogen of rangeland grasshoppers. That particular pathogen has actually been commercialized and produced and is used for grasshopper control, not for homeowners, but for grassland management in the West. There are a few viruses that attack insects that people have begun to work with to manage, and the one that's used in organic production of food is a virus that kills codling moths in apples. So let's take a look a little quicker at, or a little more detailed, but still not too long, at these OMRI pesticides. Bt is, again, this soil bacterium. Most of the formulations of Bt, which again stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, are ones that kill caterpillars. The insects eat them. The toxins attach to the gut wall on receptors that are found only in caterpillars. The gut wall breaks down, all the bacteria that were in the gut get in the inside of the insect, and it poisons them by bacterial septicemia. These products are not toxic to honeybees or to birds or to mammals. That's why they've been commercialized so widely. Bacillus papilii is the one that shows up in Japanese beetles. It does reduce larval damage in turf, meaning you can treat lawns and reduce damage from grubs. If you treat your lawn hoping that you're going to keep all the adult Japanese beetles out of your garden, you're going to have to be sure that everybody in about 30 miles of you treats all the turf with something, because they're going to find you otherwise. Entrust, these spinosad products, are also produced in fermentation. They're especially used against caterpillars, Colorado potato beetle, and thrips. The trade names are Entrust and spinosad, and realize there are some formulations of these products on the market that are not OMRI certified, meaning if you're actually growing for certified organic production, you could not use those, or if you're going to claim you're producing organically, you should not use those other ones. They simply have some different adjuvants in the spray mix that are synthetic, and that separates them out in terms of organic certification. The only fungal pathogen product out there is mycotrol or some version of it. Again, these work when they're applied for specific insects that are generally soil-dwelling or living on the ground or living in really moist environments. There's a lot of fungal pathogens of insects, and when we get really dry years, they don't do much. In really dry habitats, neither do the fungal preparations that we buy and use as microbial insecticides. It's a little strange to think that you would purposefully introduce nematodes to a garden, but the nematodes that are packaged and sold for insect control are pathogenic just to insects. They are in these two genera, Steinernema and Heterorhabditis. The insect crawls in the spiracles or the mouth or the anal opening of an insect. It's carrying some bacteria with it. It's sort of a little farmer. It regurgitates the bacteria inside the nematode. The bacteria multiply in huge numbers, kill the insect, and the nematode eats the bacteria. Sure is fun talking about that, right? Anyway, not everything is susceptible, even in moist habitats, and the nematodes really only work in moist habitats. You'll see products that contain these that show cucumber beetles and rootworm beetles, and it says you can apply this to kill them. Well, you can if you're killing the stage in the soil, but you can't apply them to dry foliage and expect anything to happen. It just doesn't work. There are plant-derived products that we could broadly say include oils and soaps, pyrethrins, neem, horticultural oils, and insecticidal soaps. The pyrethrins are derived from an African chrysanthemum and some other flowers that are closely related. The ones that you use as a packaged product generally are extracts of those flowers. They contain one or more of this group of naturally occurring chemicals called pyrethrins. They're generally pretty good against leaf-feeding beetles, some caterpillars, not aphids or mites, and basically they break down extremely rapidly. Now, pyrethrins are different than synthetic pyrethroids. The pyrethroids that are used in commercial production last much longer. The reason the pyrethrins are approved for organic production is that they are in fact derived naturally, and secondly, they break down really quickly. Especially in sunlight. Neem, you see products like Azadirachta and Neemix and others. Neem is derived from plants in either the genus Azadirachta or Melia, a lot of them in southern Asia. Neem is used there as a medicinal plant. The products that we use as insecticides are used primarily against aphids and whiteflies and thrips, things that don't move much or are really soft-bodied or thin-skinned. Some work well, some don't. One of the issues about plant oils is even though that oil is derived from the same plant, its components are not always the same, related to environment or be it either heat or moisture, soil fertility, whatever it may be. The oils from the same species of plant are not always the same, in the same way that a flavor of a tomato or the flavor of a grape can change during different conditions. As a result of that, sometimes you get products that work quite well, as the label would imply, and sometimes not much at all. There are oils that are used just for their oiliness, their physical characteristics. They are usually oils that are mixed with an emulsifier and applied to plants to thoroughly coat foliage and stems and leaves. Some of them are dormant oils that are applied before leaves are present so they don't cause problems with damaging leaves. What they do is coat the bodies of insects, and they disrupt in general their respiration. They disrupt the way that air moves in and out of the spiracles or the holes on the side of their body that they use for respiration. They do work well against, again, soft-bodied, immobile insects, things that don't move much. Adding garlic or hot pepper to those oils and selling them as so much better than anything else is a nice claim, but it doesn't really have any basis in fact. The plain horticultural oils, Sunspray UFO or any other one that you might buy is going to work just as well as the garlic or hot pepper oils. Rosemary oil and cinnamon oil do actually show in research to be a little more effective than just a plain horticultural oil, but horticultural oils alone without any of those quote essential oils, the aromatic components, work just as well in many cases. Insecticidal soaps sort of dissolve away the cuticle of insects or the waxiness of the cuticle. It also moves into the linings of the breathing system. So soaps work. I would encourage you usually to buy an insecticidal soap and make up your own. I'm not really all that worried that you put 2 tablespoons of ivory liquid soap into a gallon of water and use it as a spray that you're going to hurt anything. I am a little bit more concerned as you start to put other things into insecticides and say, well, they're naturally occurring components, they can't hurt us. That's not necessarily true. So soaps do work, again, against soft-bodied creatures.
Hey, Rick, we had a couple of quick questions regarding these substances and their safety to bees over in the chat box. I'm not sure which ones specifically, but if you have any comments on.
So far, the only ones we've covered that have much of any risk at all to bees are pyrethrins. If you spray them on the bees, it will kill the ones you spray. However, they are very short-lived. They don't show up in hives or cause problems in hives. Entrust, the spinosad compounds, those are toxic to bees, be they organic or conventional versions of these. If they're sprayed at the right time, they don't present a problem, but if they're sprayed when bees are foraging or they're sprayed into open flowers, they can kill bees, organic or not. If you move to some of the last category of these things, the ones that work physically, many of you might be familiar with diatomaceous earth. It's finely ground silica that has sharp edges at a microscopic level. It braids insects' cuticles, it absorbs the cuticular fats, and it causes them to dehydrate. It's been used in stored grain as an insecticide for a long time. Kale and clay is now one that's widely used. It's called Surround on one of its label names. In general, they work the best against adult weevils and other beetles that want to feed on the treated foliage or fruit. The problem is it's a little difficult to wash it all back off afterwards, so it's fine. I wouldn't treat peaches with it and try to sell them at the market unless you tell everybody they want to peel their peaches anyway. How about a few common insects? And again, I kept this down to vegetables. In a month, we do a session on insect control in small orchards, and we'll cover some organic practices for fruit there. These are the insects that are probably quite common and merit a little bit of discussion individually. So let's take a look at them as we go. There are all of the seed and root maggots, and the one I pictured first in the lower right is cabbage maggot, the one that shows up on the roots of cabbage family plants. The pupal stage, the little brown oval-shaped thing in the top, is what overwinters. The adult emerges from it as a fly in the early spring, and they lay their eggs in places where the soil is wet and organic matter is high. And it's going to tell you a little bit of something about cultural practices to manage them. The seed corn maggot is another species. Cabbage maggot goes to plants in the cabbage family. Onion maggot goes to plants in the onion family, and seed corn maggot goes to plants in just about any plant family. So seed corn maggot is one that goes to all of these crops. Has a very similar life cycle, goes to a lot of different crops, feeds on seeds or seedlings, and it can kill transplants, although it is much more likely to kill seedlings. And just as with cabbage maggot, it likes to lay its eggs where there are cool, wet soils, high organic matter. When the eggs hatch in 2 or 3 days, they complete development to the pupal stage in about 10 days, even in cool weather, which means if you do have damage, you go back in and replant, because that generation all comes up in big numbers and disappears in a very short time. Later in the year, there will be more generations that spread more time. Right then, you can replant safely. And the one with the restricted host range to onions is onion maggot. Again, they like high organic matter, but they also winter in cull piles. So if you think of folks who sort of compost but don't really compost and just sort of pile up vegetables somewhere not too far from where they grew and were discarded for the culls, that's producing more onion maggot flies for the next year. Unlike the other ones, this one actually will damage onions later in the season, especially if you have onions that get nicked by a hoe or a cultivator. And if you ever do see this little fly down in the bottom, that's an onion maggot or a seed corn maggot that's infected with a naturally occurring fungus. It's not one that we've been able to manage outdoors, but it's killed by a fungal pathogen. So, what can you do to control these or minimize their damage? You destroy crop residues. In the case of onions, you destroy cull onions. You plant them on as warm and as well-drained a soil as possible. And of course, we like to plant onions and some of these other things as early as possible in some cases too. One of the things you can do that delays planting is if you use a cover crop or if there is a lot of weed growth in a garden in the wintertime, incorporate it and then don't plant into it 2 or 3 days later as soon as you think it's a good time, because that material is bringing seed corn maggot especially to those soils to lay eggs. So let it decompose for a while so that seed corn maggots that are attracted come in, develop, and move on. Transplanting helps. You get less damage to transplanted crops than direct seeded crops. Row covers can keep flies off, so the floating row covers, and you avoid damaging onions by cultivation, because that will allow entry for later generations of seed corn maggot. The next thing that comes along in many gardens is cutworms. There are a couple of species that migrate. The most famous one is black cutworm. Migrates in from southern states each spring, usually in March and April. It can cut plants, as you see the corn plant that's cut in the middle picture on the right-hand side. But this cutworm and other ones, some of which winter here in the soil as partly grown cutworms, will also feed on the surface of plants, as they're doing in the radish in the lower left, or they'll feed in fruit itself. The one on the right is a cutworm feeding in the side of a tomato. So all of those are cutworms of a type. What can you do to manage them? Well, many of these, the moths are attracted to weedy areas in the fall or the spring. And the ones that overwinter in this fall, the adults have laid their eggs in weedy areas, and then you till the weeds and plant back in the spring. You can still have those cutworms in the ground and surviving. Weed control in the spring, meaning you try not to leave, especially things like chickweed, yellow rocket, etc. Those attract the moths that are flying up from the south in the spring. So if you try to control weeds, you do a better job. It also might tell you that some of the time your cover crop mix might attract some cutworms, and you just make the trade-off. You say, my cover crops give me a lot of other benefits, I may get some cutworm damage. There are insecticides you can use against the foliage-feeding species, meaning the ones that feed on leaves or feed on the fruits of tomatoes. And those are Entrust and BT. They generally aren't very effective against the ones that are just cutting them off at the ground level, and it just has to do with how they're tied up with dirt on the surface of the plant. They're also something where the insect doesn't eat very much of them, so it doesn't get much of the poison. And yes, indeed, on small-scale plantings, you can just simply use exclusion with cans or cups around plants. Flea beetles. These are the little tiny beetles that are called flea beetles because they jump like fleas. Usually they're dark-colored. Some are a little prettier than others. There are different species that feed on different families of plants. So when you see the flea beetles on corn, that's not the same one that's on cabbage. That's not the same one that's on tomatoes and potatoes. There's a little overlap, but in general, they're on different families of plants. They winter as adults, and they seem to sort of come out of the ground when the plant comes out of the ground. They find plants very quickly in the spring. In general, what you are going to say about, do I need to control these insects? So the threshold, how many does it take before I need to worry about it? The threshold is generally going to be something that seems to be stunting plants because they're so defoliated, or if you're growing leafy greens, when will you or the people you sow your greens to say, no, there are too many holes in that, there have been too many insects, I don't want to eat it? That's the threshold. You can't let that happen, whether it's yours or going to somebody else. The greatest populations show up in weedy fields for the ones that are on, say, cabbage. Cabbage and the cabbage family plants. Weeds around those fields tend to help them. The glossy leaf varieties of say, turnip greens and mustard greens get more flea beetles than what the curly ones do. You can intercrop cabbage family plants with tomatoes to get a little benefit. You can till in crop residues immediately. And why do you do that? What you're doing is saying, if I leave this plant out here, all the insects that are on it get to continue to eat for as long as they want and produce and lay more eggs and produce a greater population next time. So when you're done with a crop, till it in for reasons of insect and disease management both. Row covers applied early will help as long as you get them on before the beetles are in there. Pyrethrins are generally the most effective as far as the OMRI insecticides go. Surround and Entrust get a few positive reports, but not too many.
Rick, we had another quick question about would DE be effective? I believe it was for the flea beetles, I'm assuming is what they're asking.
I would guess this is aimed at flea beetles as well. Yes, it can be. Remember one issue, though. If these things are showing up in the spring of the year, it's when there's usually more moisture. If you apply diatomaceous earth and it gets wet, it is no longer of much value. Diatomaceous earth will do some good applied as a very, very fine dust on days when it's dry and clear. As soon as it gets wet, it loses its value. Same kinds of things when you look at flea beetles on other crops. This is just the flea beetle that's on, or the group of flea beetles that are on the nightshade family plants, the potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, etc. In general, you often escape much problem with these. Realize those plants, once they are either, in the case of potatoes coming out of the ground or tomatoes transplanted, they are growing fast enough that you usually don't have to control flea beetles. If you do, it's because you're losing nearly 30% or more, a third or more of the leaf area. The exception is eggplant, because eggplant gets enough flea beetles that they just cover the leaves and eat them all. And in those, you do need to use something for control, and it's going to be the same insecticides we just talked about in the slide before. How about if we do an insect that sort of thwarts all our best intentions? This is potato leafhopper. It's a little tiny insect, yellow-green in color. You wouldn't think it could move far, but in fact it migrates in on weather fronts from Louisiana and Texas every year, usually somewhere in late May and early June. When it lands on plants, and especially potatoes and green beans in gardens, it feeds on leaves, injects some saliva when it feeds, and that's toxic to the plant, and it causes the plant to curl. In alfalfa, they call it hopper burn. In potatoes, they call it the same thing. In beans, the symptom doesn't look the same, but you get this downward curling and cupping of leaves. And it's because of potato leaf hopper damage. And it's one that nothing you do in terms of rotation or planting time or whatever, short of not having the crop there when it's present, nothing you do prevents it from being there. Anything you do that encourages natural enemies reduces the numbers or keeps the numbers from growing as fast. But in terms of just how you grow the crop, you can't keep it away. By the way, it is very much a generalist. It feeds on virtually every vegetable. It doesn't cause as much damage in some. It feeds on roses and redbuds and maple trees and apple trees and all sorts of things. The controls are either row covers to keep them off or pyrethrins to kill them. Or you accept some damage, which, of course, we all know is one of the other things you do. But if we talk about all the Leps, the Lepidoptera, the caterpillars that feed on cabbage. One is imported cabbage worm. This one winters in that chrysalis stage in the lower right, the pupa inside a naked covering, no silken cocoon around it. It overwinters in that stage. This one becomes active before any of the other ones. It takes about 4 or 5 weeks to get a generation to progress from egg to adult to new eggs, so we see several generations a year. One thing about it is, if you do need to control it in plants, it is extremely easily controlled with BT and Entrust. It's really susceptible to those products, and those products don't directly kill their natural enemies. The next one that shows up, and it does not winter here well, but a few adults winter in milder winters. We might not expect as many of them right away from overwintering populations, is diamondback moth. But it's also a little tiny caterpillar that comes in on transplants when transplants are shipped into garden centers and anywhere else in the spring of the year. So when it's brought in, the insects may or may not have some insecticide resistance issues. It's not what you have sprayed in your garden or what anybody else has sprayed in the whole region. It is what happened in the area where they were produced. So if you buy transplants and bring them in, the insects on them, if it's diamondback moth, may or may not be as susceptible to some insecticides as they would be if they were homegrown. This one also goes through lots of generations a year. Little tiny caterpillar, but it can show up in huge numbers. In general, it's controlled with BT or spinosad Entrust in organic production, although you can actually find BT-resistant populations. And then the last one that shows up is cabbage looper. This is the great big one. It's about 1.5 inches long when the larvae are mature. A little longer generation time, a little later arriver in the spring of the year. But this one is tougher to control organically by using insecticides because it's just not as susceptible to BT. So what do you do with these? Even in commercial production, people don't try to keep plants free of these creatures. And I'm not suggesting you're going to use the same ideas of numbers or percentages in backyards as are used in commercial production, but it still gives you an idea. In seedbed, in very early production, you try not to allow much of anything to show up. So if you're growing your own transplants, then you really don't want to move infested seedlings back out to the field. So if you find a small percentage that are infested, you would treat them with BT or Entrust. From transplant to cupping in cabbage or to heading in broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower, you pretty much say, a few of those things eating a little bit of leaf material doesn't bother me much. I'll let them alone. Their natural enemies will build up and it'll help keep them in check. And then when you got crop that's heading and you don't want a worm in the head if you're going to eat it or sell it, if that's your standard, then you spray when numbers are a little lower again. And this is percentage of plants infested with any kind of, quote, Lep. And then what works to control them? Yeah, you can keep them off with row covers if you put them out right away. BT products work. Entrust also works, and the reason these are preferred compared to, say, using Pyganic or using Neem is that, number one, they work better. Number two, they don't, in fact, control the parasitic wasps or the other insects that are feeding on imported cabbage worm or diamondback moth or cabbage looper. Entrust has a little toxicity to certain things like lacewings, but in fact, in general, you like them because they kill what you're after, but they don't hurt much of anything else. That's their benefit. The question in the chat box, generally speaking, do you want to rotate tomatoes to different areas, making sure that soil nutrients are adequate in all places? Sure you do. For some insects that bother tomatoes, it'll make no difference, but you want to do it, if nothing else, for the disease control benefit. Rotations in gardens usually have a much greater disease control benefit than they do insect control benefit. Cucumber beetles, everybody knows and loves these guys. Striped and spotted beetles overwinter as adults. In cucumbers and muskmelons, they carry bacterial wilt, and that makes them especially important. What can you do? Well, first, I guess you understand that if you're growing cucumbers or melons and you see a few beetles and you've done the other things you would have done to try to prevent them, and it's too late to cover plants because bloom has started, realize that just a couple of beetles per plant is a much greater risk than it is in watermelon and squash, because those plants aren't very susceptible to the disease bacterial wilt. Muskmelons and cucumbers are. So it doesn't take many for a commercial grower to say, I probably need to control those. What can you do culturally? This is another one of those where when you quit picking any of the plants in the cucurbit family, pull them out of the ground, put them in a compost pile, or till them into the ground, or do something. Don't keep feeding cucumber beetles and squash bugs for a long time and letting them reproduce longer. Row covers work, pyrethrins work okay, but you got to spray them over and over. Surround is not very consistent, and if you use pyrethrins, you have to spray when the bees aren't foraging. In the past 2 seasons, we have had leek moths. What to do? I'm honestly going to have to tell you, you're going to need to send me an email message for that one, because it's not an insect I know so well that I can make a recommendation to you without taking a look. So if you email me that question, I'll try to answer you sometime later. Squash bugs, even for commercial growers, until some better insecticides came out a few years ago, these were sort of the bug from hell in squash and pumpkins. And they are still a little bit that way, and especially for organic growers. The adults winter, they don't become active until sort of later than other creatures, early to midsummer. And you're going to see eggs on leaves first. They hatch to form nymphs, and the nymphs and the adults suck juices out of plants, reduce yield, cause plants to wilt. You can destroy crop residue as soon as possible. You can destroy eggs by hand. For the backyard gardener with 6 zucchini plants and a couple of melons and a couple of this, that probably beats anything else you would do, even if you were willing to spray other insecticides. If you do spray, really none of them work very well, of the organic insecticides. Surround plus pyrethrins, and some people will add Neem, are marginally effective, but real simply, that's spraying a lot of stuff, whether it's OMRI listed or not. I find growing radishes keep the squash bugs at bay. I'm glad you find that. I'm not sure if everybody listening tries that and says they don't get any squash bugs this year, please report that back, because it's not necessarily known to be true. I never tell somebody, no, that can't be true. I'll tell you that's an observation not everybody else has made. So feel fortunate. Just don't feel too confident until you get to make it a few times, okay? Colorado potato beetle, you know what it looks like. Winters as an adult, a couple of generations a year. Rotation helps. Although when you're in a backyard and your rotation is 40 feet, that's not quite as good as 40 yards, and it's not as good as a quarter mile. They don't move well as adults when they come out of the ground in the spring. That's why mulching outside rows of potatoes slows their movement into the rest of a field or a planting. Some people will trench along the side of a garden closest to where they were the year before, and they don't move well through the trenching. Flaming on small plants can kill adults. Row covers can keep them off if they're tightly against the soil surface. You can pick adults and larvae, and then this one Bacillus thuringiensis product from a different subspecies does work. Entrust also works against Colorado potato beetles. Aphids.
Rick, I think there's also another question, I think from an earlier slide, about could covers still be helpful if I hand pollinate? I don't think that was on the potato beetle, but from a previous.
Anything you can hand pollinate or anything that doesn't require pollination, you can leave the row covers on them longer as long as you can effectively accomplish that. You know, at some point, plants sort of outgrow covers unless you put a lot of space underneath it. And in some cases, they start to hold a little extra heat. Not always, but that can be an issue. Aphids, everybody's favorite little creatures. They're so prevalent because when you see aphids on plants, they're almost always all females, and they're almost always giving birth to young females without mating, so populations just explode rapidly. They do have lots of natural enemies. There are parasitic wasps, there are fungal diseases, there are lots of predators, and those are usually what keep aphids in check. You see aphids on plants, there are no specific thresholds. What you usually do if you're going to say, would I spray anything to try to control them, if that's something you would consider, is you would say, I find aphids on these plants, I'm going to mark the plants that are infested. I'm going to look again in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days, and do I have more aphids or more natural enemies, and decide whether or not it seems like the population might be controlled by the natural enemies. You're going to not use insecticides that kill natural enemies. You know, the conventional gardeners, we always say 7 and pyrethroids are especially a problem, but realize that pyganic also kills lady beetles and parasitic wasps if you spray them. So to conserve natural enemies, you wouldn't spray those things, and you would also think of all the interplantings that help provide pollen and nectar for these parasitic wasps and for lady beetles, because they don't feed just on insects. They also feed on pollen and nectar. The OMRI insecticides are generally soaps and summer oils, and again, there's no real benefit to adding or to buying a garlic oil or a hot pepper oil. Corn earworm is tomato fruit worm, same insect by another name, feeds on lots of different plants, and this is the one that is the cause in most cases when you see holes in tomatoes. Now, tomato hornworm, the much larger one, will eat big chunks out of the sides of tomatoes. Some of the cutworms will move into tomatoes, but this is the most frequent culprit, and it's the same insect that shows up in the tips of ears of sweet corn. It lays its eggs on the silks in sweet corn, lays eggs on the leaves in tomatoes, sometimes even right under the calyx in tomatoes. In commercial production, people use these large pheromone traps to detect when corn earworms migrate into the area and to know if they need to spray or not. And the reason for that is that this insect actually winters in the south, survives winters, even this winter. It will survive in Texas and Louisiana. And sometime in the summer, populations increase at a time when weather is correct. They rise up in the thermals and they get transported on fronts until they reach a frontal boundary, and where the rain comes out, the insects come out. And that's how we get corn earworm every year. There's a little bit of overwintering, but not very much. And when it comes in, it doesn't care if your corn is planted where it was last year or if it's planted someplace entirely different. It finds corn especially, and it finds tomatoes. So that's the story I just told you. When the commercial growers trap for this, the commercial sweet corn growers, if they catch 5 or 10 moths in the top of this trap, they will treat. They'll begin treating when corn is silking to keep the insects out of the tips of ears. If you do that in your smaller scale production, the products that you can use are spinosad, the Entrust product, or BT. BT works in tomatoes but not in sweet corn, and you're saying, yeah, this is some sales pitch again here or something like that. But realize that corn earworm does not eat anything in sweet corn until it gets inside the silk channel. So you can put BT on the outside of the silks by spraying it. The egg hatches, it crawls down the silk channel, it starts to eat, and it hasn't ingested any of the BT, so it doesn't work. In tomatoes, you are not only spraying the outside of the fruit where the insect starts to eat, but it also eats some on foliage. And so you manage to control it with BT much more effectively than you can't really control it at all in sweet corn with BT. In something where silks continue to grow in sweet corn, as they continue to grow, the fresh silk that's not treated is closest to the tip of the ear, not at the end of that silk. And as a result, people who are trying to keep worm-free ears of corn have to treat repeatedly, which is why, in fact, for backyard gardeners and CSAs and organic growers at farmers markets, you probably ought to say, I have trouble controlling this insect. I'm going to chop off the tip of the ears, I'll throw in an extra ear or two, and this is why I do it, because I don't want to use the conventional insecticides that work better. And you ought to understand the reason why the guys do use conventional insecticides when they have to sell corn without worms in the ears is because they have to keep them out. That's just the nature of their business. I think stink bugs and plant bugs are my last creatures here as I run out of time. These things winter as adults. They feed on all sorts of different plants, so they come into your garden. They feed on tomatoes or peppers where they stick their stylet into a plant. You get this corky material underneath. It looks the same whether it's peppers or tomatoes or peaches or apples or green beans or whatever it may be. That's the damage. If the fruit is still growing rapidly, it may grow in a distorted shape around where the stink bugs fed. You come up to plants in a garden and start to look a little bit and say, I don't see any brown stink bugs. It's because they drop to the ground when you start to look around, and you don't see them because they're so well camouflaged. Entomologists use something they call a beating tray and just rustle the plant and look to see what falls. You can do the same thing with the just turn a lid of a styrofoam cooler upside down, hold it under branches or leaves and shake them around and see what drops. It's a way to know what's there. This one's really tough to control in gardens. Real honestly, in organic production, trying to control stink bugs is really tough. What the commercial orchardists do to try to limit problems in orchards is they try to keep all of those row middles while they drive their sprayers and their machinery. They try to keep it as nothing but grass and no broadleaf plants, because the broadleaf plants attract the stink bugs. And so one of the ways they make the orchard as a whole less attractive is to do that. Well, think about what a backyard is like, and especially a backyard with a good organic garden. You have so many things that attract stink bugs, and not many natural enemies attack stink bugs. And as a result, you have creatures that are sometimes hard to control. So, if you need to control them, people will mix a bunch of products. Don't generally do a very good job. Where you can exclude them, it works for as long as you can do that. And if you haven't heard of it yet, do a Google sometime for brown marmorated stink bug. It's the new species that's spreading to us, and it's going to be even worse than all the other ones, and it is going to be a big threat to organic production. It's going to test how we can possibly go about controlling it. Good reference at the end of this. Garden Insects of North America is by Whitney Cranshaw. If you don't have this book and you're interested in insect management in gardens, you really ought to get it. It really isn't about pesticides, but it is about identification and biology of pests, which is something you need to know when you think about what causes infestations to occur. It's 600 and some pages, sells for $30, and has hundreds and hundreds of good color pictures. And then other references, We do a newsletter for fruit and vegetable growers. It is clearly for commercial growers. So we don't spend a lot of time on small-scale garden solutions, but if you're interested in what's going on in commercial production, some of it's the same thing for gardeners. Cornell has a series of good organic production guides for fruits and vegetables. North Carolina State has a nice general overview about organic farming systems. And so does that final reference from Cornell. It's a general overview of organic production systems. I see in the chat box, is straw mulch a poor choice if there are stick and squash bugs also prevalent? If you're not putting your straw mulch where the squash bugs were last year, meaning you've moved squash to a new spot and you mulch around it, that should not necessarily favor anything. If you leave mulch in place where you've got squash this year, yes, that helps their survival through the winter. Stink bugs, I don't think the mulch is an issue. They aren't coming to feed on that or really even seek shelter in it. They like broadleaf plants because they have flowers and then they eventually have seed pods with seeds in them. Stink bugs especially like seed pods and seeds. What else do you have for questions, anybody? Chickens. Yeah, but not commercially, okay? Chickens do provide control of some insects, others they don't touch. They can be of value. If you are a market gardener and you would like to run chickens in the same place where you are growing peas and green beans, somebody just added in for me exactly what I was going to say. It can be a food safety issue. Granted, people have done this in home gardens forever, but when you chose to do that in your home garden, you knew that there might be chicken poop on something, and you probably didn't eat the green beans that were hanging on the ground in the chicken poop without cooking them first. When somebody goes to a farmer's market and buys a product like that, they may decide to chew on a couple of beans before they decide to take them home, wash them, and cook them. Food safety concerns mean that producers who want to sell into certain markets have to be certified for good agricultural practices, and that generally means you don't have any poop-producing animals where you have food at the same time. It's simply, you may call it common sense, you may call it overkill, but it is the reality of the situation. Is there a risk of a buildup of DE causing a problem in your soil or harming beneficials in the soil or visiting the plants? Diatomaceous earth, you probably could not use it, could not afford to use it in amounts that would influence soil quality. However, yes, you could get a little, I don't know how much bee injury you could get. Theoretically, you could injure bees. In general, whatever gets to the soil is not doing anything important for insect control in the soil. Suggestion for control of aphids and other plants are attracted to, or aphids are attracted, plant other plants that aphids are attracted to, like sunflowers. For perhaps certain aphids, yes. However, the aphids that go to, let's pick one for example, aphids on pumpkins are largely cotton melon aphid, and that one will not go to sunflower. Aphids are not all species specific, but some of them are. And so the aphids that go to one plant may or may not be the aphids that go to another. I would encourage you to plant the sunflower and the nasturtium for their other benefits, but understand that none of that is complete. Sorry folks, insects evolved way too successfully. There are some different insects for everybody. How do I get rid of aphids from my hibiscus? Don't know an answer other than to suggest soap sprays or Neem products. However, the other approach is to say make sure you got plenty of things around that support natural enemies. How do I download materials listed as PDF files? You go to those websites, you can choose the download for the SARE materials. For these here at the end, you have to go to those websites. I do believe, Kyle, am I correct, that this will all be archived so you guys can come back to this, find those links if you don't have them otherwise, and you'll be able to get to these links to all of these sites. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
That's correct. Everyone will receive an archived version so they can go through at their leisure and they can click on links and other things. So,
my best squash season was when I had a boom of spiders, and are they natural enemies of squash bugs? To some degree, yes. To some degree, they are. Does that mean spiders usually keep up with squash bugs? They usually don't, but they are predators. And realize when we say spiders, there's a huge range of different kinds of spider predators out there, from the orb weavers to the jumping spiders to the wolf spiders to you name it. Different ones have different effects on certain kinds of insects. I believe that is the last of the slides I have.